Hi everyone. So today's lesson we're looking at the causes of hunger and famine. So there are basically four elements of food security and this impacts on hunger but also famine as well. So we have food availability. So this is how much food is available for local um, production, which can then either result in hunger or famine. And then the availability to import food as well. So if you can't grow food, how are you able to import it? The access to food will then impact on hunger. So being able to correctly store food and availability to pay for food at the markets as well will also influence whether someone suffers from hunger. So there's also food stability. So this actually refers to both hunger and famine. Hunger in that if you can't get food in, then people go hungry. Famine in that if you don't have any infrastructure for getting food into a place, then there will be famine, which is long term. And then there's also food utilization, so the ability to actually use food. So looking at the amount of fuel and water needed for the food, as well as the health um, of actually using the food. So there are a whole bunch of different factors that impact on food availability, and in that case, hunger and famine. So war will prevent the distribution of food, which can result in both hunger and famine. And the government might actually use food for military use only, so not for local citizens. There are also the death of workers in food production, manufacture, and distribution because they've been sent off to war. This means that no one is able to plant or harvest crops, and therefore a region may develop famine as a result for that. You also have war that leaves behind landmines, which means that some land that could be used for agricultural purposes can't be because it's considered dangerous. There's also the destruction of food manufacturing plants, which means that you can't manufacture and either import or export food, which can then result in loss of jobs, leading back to hunger because people can't afford to buy food. And war also ruins crops as well, so that results in famine. So it's really important to understand the difference between hunger and famine. Hunger is as a result of not having enough food to eat due to not being able to buy it or the availability. Whereas famine is usually experienced in a community, whether that be local or regional, which is actually the availability of food, even though you may have the money to buy food. And that could be due to a whole bunch of reasons that we're going to go into. So cash crops actually impact on the famine of a region because they take up agricultural land, and rather than using that land to grow crops for the local community, it's used to grow what are called cash crops, so crops that like tea, cotton, cacao, coffee. They're all examples of cash crops, and when they grow the crops, they actually export them overseas, and the local community doesn't get access to any of that food. Or if they do, they get it as it's resold out of a huge company at a really marked up value. So, drought and other natural disasters can also impact on famine. So if you have crop production may be limited due to drought, you might get destruction of crops through tsunamis or wildfires. Having a change in climate will also impact on the amount of agricultural land, and all of this means that you have a lack of crops, which means you'll result in famine and also potentially hunger as well, because of a lack of availability of food, as well as an inability to grow the food. So a lack of safe drinking water can also result in famine because any waterborne diseases will impact on the local community, because the workers will be sick, so they can't plant and harvest the crops, and that results in famine. However, there's also that an individual will suffer from hunger because they can't afford to buy food because they're not working. And that will then have the potential for famine in a community as well. So famine and hunger are kind of interconnected. So poor health also contributes to hunger and famine. If the individuals are weak, they can't afford to work and therefore they can't buy food and they are hungry. But if the workers can't harvest the crops, then the crops will die and there won't be food in the community, therefore that results in famine. So education will also result in famine and hunger. So you can either look at it from an educational point of view in terms of planting and harvesting crops in an appropriate practice for the land that's available, and if they need to uh, or increase their crop production, and if they don't use the right agricultural practices for that, it could result in a lack of food produced, and that can result in famine. Whereas if people have a lack of access to education, their ability to earn money in a job is limited, and therefore they can't afford to eat, and then that would result in hunger. So discrimination can also result in hunger and famine in a community, and discrimination could be based on gender, race, or religion as well.
Gender inequality doesn't make sense on any level. By marginalizing the rights of women, we deny ourselves the opportunity to lift millions of men, women, and children out of poverty, not to mention the chance of a just and fair world. From birth, girls and boys, women and men are expected by society to play certain roles and behave in certain ways based on traditions, religion, and other beliefs. These behaviors are learned and shape the gender norms in a society. Unfortunately, in many countries, gender norms create disadvantages for women. Often, girls are not sent to school. When they become women, they then have limited ability to earn money or realize their potential. Rural women play a major role in agricultural development. However, in many developing countries, women cannot formally own land. Without land, they cannot get loans to invest in their farms or businesses. This also means they have no control over the use of land or the benefits that come from it. Men generally control the household decisions, like how to use the family's assets. These disadvantages are often reinforced by practices that limit women's access to services, like training. Cultural beliefs can also restrict women's opportunities, such as in parts of Zambia where women cannot paddle their boats as it is considered bad omen. The result of these issues? Women remain poor and agricultural production cannot reach its potential, perpetuating poverty and hunger in the developing world. The social norms that limit women's opportunities need to be understood and then changed. By taking a gender transformative approach, we can influence social norms and bridge the gaps in access to resources and services between men and women in a lasting manner. Change is needed on many levels, and both men and women must be involved for it to happen. Research and development organizations need to invest in programs that promote gender equality alongside improving productivity and incomes. Policies need to be implemented that increase women's access to services and resources. Communities need to support women as farmers and as leaders. Increasing women's voice and agency is a valuable end in its own right. When development organizations, policies, and communities support the success of women, we have a chance to reduce extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity for girls and boys, women and men around the world.
Okay, so gender discrimination does mean that women are at a disadvantage when it comes to being affected by hunger and famine. And particularly looking in the developed countries, women are poorest in those countries. So a lot of children are kept out of school, and two-thirds of those are women or are female. And two-thirds of the world's illiterates are actually female as well. And this means that their ability to become educated and pick their chosen careers or jobs means that their ability to earn money is also restricted, which then results in hunger. Um, So I won't go through this as well. You can read this in the PowerPoint. But if we do look at 80% of the food produced in sub-Saharan Africa is actually due to women, yet only 1% of women own land, receive 7% of farm extension services, and receive less than 10% of the credit given to small-scale farmers. So women are not being empowered by having access to small loans. So here's an example of a Food for Schools program. You can have a read of that in Yemen. Again, this is another example that you could include in your extended response at the end of your exam. Uh, Racial discrimination is based on genealogy, bloodlines, or physical appearance and can cause hunger and famine or inequality between people on this earth. Um, can be due to civil war. It does tend to cause oppression, so lack of education, credit, and employment, which impacts their risk of suffering from either hunger or famine. And then we have ethnic discrimination as well. So that's based on either social or cultural association. Usually results in a lack of access to education, credit, and employment, which will impact their risk of developing either hunger or famine. We've got another case study from Sudan, so make sure you read that one. So poverty cycles tend to um, impact on hunger. So poor people can't afford nutritious food. This makes them weaker and less able to earn money. The children from poor families have reduced income prospects, so they have what's called a lifelong poverty cycle. Sorry. So the farmers can't afford to plant crops. Growing crops without proper tools and fertilization makes them less profitable. So the poor are hungry and their hunger keeps them poor. So if you look at this, we've got a low income family that has less access to food, safe water, healthcare, and school. That results in hunger, poor sanitation, and lack of education. Therefore, they have fewer opportunities. They have disease, malnutrition, and even death. They're then depleted and unskilled workforce and unemployment, which means they are in a low income family and the cycle just keeps continuing. So food wastage is another issue that is causing hunger in communities. We waste a lot of food as Australians. 1 in 5 bags are actually that you purchase at the supermarket are chucked out, either as leftovers or food that's gone off. Now, food wastage can occur in multiple parts of the production to, or what we'd say, farm to plate. So the production, which is food loss, either occurs here due to agricultural practices being inappropriate or inadequate. Then during processing, we have excessive packaging that will lose food that way because of the offcuts. So how food's packaged and what's actually processed and chucked out in that time, and then retail as well. So ideas like use by dates, rejection of products for aesthetic reasons, so bananas that are too big or too small, or purchasing food that is more than we're prepared to eat. So apples that only come in a bag when really we only want one or two, and therefore we chuck out the rest. So if we look at food wastage in comparison to developed and developing countries, there is not a lot of food wastage by consumers in developing countries if you compare that to developed countries. If you have a look at where food wastage occurs, in the US and the UK, a majority of the food wastage occurs in home rather than in farm, food service, retail, or on the farm. Whereas in developing countries, most of the food wastage occurs on the farm and the transporting process, and that's because of lack of funds for or education. So 1/3 of the world's needs, 1/3, 1.3 billion tons of food is spoiled or discarded each year. In North America, 2% is by processing and packaging, whereas in but 28% of that is actually for consumers. And if you compare that to South and Southeast Asia, so in developing countries, most of it is occurring in the processing and packaging phase compared to the actual consumers. So consumers in third world countries tend to be way more frugal with their money, with their food, in comparison to people that live in developed countries or in the West. So I won't go through this, you can have a read of that. So developed versus developing. Another case study about corruption in the food supply chain, which impacts on food wastage. So about 20 to 40% of vegetables are rejected purely for cosmetic standards. So carrots that are not straight, bananas that are straight when they should be curved, which is just ridiculous because they just taste fine as they are. So food waste does contribute to food shortage because Um, the bulk of foods wasted are more nutritionally dense fresh fruits and vegetables, so that heavily processed foods, which are tend to be less nutritionally sound, are what is kept and will impact on a person's nutrition. And that's what we're going to look at next week is the actual consequences of hunger and famine. So the last thing I want to look at is that free trade versus fair trade. So free trade is the trading of goods between countries without taxes. The product passes from the grower to storer, to wholesaler, to processor, to packager, and then from the retailer then to the consumer. So each person adds their markup ranging from 2 to 200%, depending on the product. So it means that this guy here is not getting a lot of money, particularly if this person farms it and then ends up buying it over here, the massive markup could be up to 200%. So the gains of the trade are not equally distributed in free trade due to the unequal development of different countries. So a lot of these crops, if we look at coffee, for example, they're cash crops. So they're planted in places in third world countries and then bought off incredibly cheaply and then marked up ridiculously. So if we have a look at the amount of, or the percent of money, the farmer gets 3 cents out of a regular cup of coffee. So if you look at coffee as $4. And then what the retailer, the roasters, the exporters, and the buyers get is completely different. So a free trade system really doesn't help underdeveloped countries and just keeps them poor and in poverty. So fair trade is the idea that is supposed to combat this, where they're looking at better prices and decent working conditions for the people that are actually farming the products or these. So if I'm sure you've seen this before, and this is actually developing. It's making these steps closer to stop the markup that you see in the conventional coffee journey. So if you want to be ethically responsible about purchasing your coffee, you should look for coffee or tea that has the fair trade logo on it because you know that the workers are getting a fairer amount of money. So if we have a look at our comparison, here's our free trade cup of coffee and here's our fair trade cup of coffee. And you can see that the farmers get significantly more money for their crops in a fair trade cup of coffee compared to a free trade. And there are a whole bunch. This is kind of the World Fair Trade Organization goals or the principles of fair trade and why it's important as well. And it's to do with poverty, and poverty results in hunger and famine, and it is very prevalent in third world countries. So another case study is Cadbury trying to take steps in a fair trade system by supporting their cacao, and that's to help Ghana farmers participating in agricultural training so that they're more educated so they can increase their yield and to have better amounts of money as well for their actual services.